Hey everybody! So this week I'm going to share my thoughts on the historicity of Jesus. Sounds like a wild ride, right? But before you get all geared up to fight me or someone in the comments, let's be clear about something. I'm not here to take a stand on whether Jesus was purely mythical or in some way historical. To the contrary, my point is that a yes-no question about whether a real Jesus existed is actually pretty nonsensical. To show why, let's start with a couple ways of approaching Jesus that I find inadequate. First, we could just take the Gospels at their word and assume Jesus was the Son of God and did a bunch of miracles. This is silly on its face, sorry any Christians watching, so most non-fundamentalists will quickly dismiss it and move on to a second option, which is that there was a historical Jesus but he just didn't do the supernatural stuff. To do that, I guess we just draw a line between the supernatural and natural parts of the Gospel stories, and somewhere on the natural side we find a reasonable account of a teacher who launched a religion but later had supernatural legends attached to him. But even this is problematic. A cursory glance at the natural side should show enough red flags to make you question accepting it wholesale as the biography of a real-life person, which leaves you to sift through individual stories and teachings to get a sense of which ones seem practically impossible, which sound just a little too formulaic, and which details could have been plausibly recorded with any reasonable accuracy decades after the fact. At this point, you're not deciding, was there a historical Jesus, as much as trying to figure out whether someone might have resembled the gospel character in enough unique ways that calling him Jesus would even be semantically defensible. That's what we're going to do in this video. To start, let's draw a line that represents the gradient of conclusions people could reach about Jesus. On one end, we'll place a conclusion most of us here will disagree with, that Jesus was a demigod exactly as portrayed in the Gospels, and on the other we'll place an extremely general conclusion I think we all can agree with, that there were a lot of rogue apocalyptic preachers roaming around first century Judea, and that these preachers helped inspire stories about Jesus. Then we'll look through gospel stories and ask questions to help us consider how realistic they seem. The more detail you think accurately describes a real person in specific ways, the further you move away from the generality on the right and the more you think a specific person was uniquely and meaningfully Jesus. Conversely, if you find yourself discarding one detail after the other as unlikely until there's not much left, you might ask yourself what about a historical person would make him Jesus at all. Now a couple things before we move on. I'm not going to move along the chart. As much as my skepticism is going to seep through at times, I'm here to try to help you think through your own conclusions, and this is just a visual meant to help you frame your own analysis. If you want to draw your own chart and mark it up with notes, go ahead. I'd actually be curious to see what you come up with, so share it with me on Twitter if you want. Second, I recognize that I'm not a scholar and this is an extremely non-academic exercise. Things I'm sure a lot of people will point out to me in the comments even though I just said it. This is just a suggested starting point for lay people like us to approach the Gospels from a common-sense perspective. If you have interest in digging deeper, great. I'd encourage you to explore more scholarly sources. I'm not here to shortcut my way to dramatic conclusions I'm not qualified to make. And if there's one thing we should take away from this, it's that specific answers to these questions are pretty elusive and subject to speculation, so maybe atheists can chill out a little if they find themselves having different opinions about how historical Jesus was. Anyway, let's start at the beginning with
Part 1. The Early Life of Jesus.
Now obviously we don't think he was conceived by the Holy Spirit, born of a virgin, or foretold by angels because, sorry Christians who are still here, that's all silly. But what about the non-supernatural parts? Do we actually think Jesus was born in Bethlehem to residents of Nazareth because they had to travel for an unlikely census? That wise men from a faraway land somehow navigated to him using a star to bring him expensive gifts? Did the king of Israel kill all the young boys in Bethlehem? And did Jesus end up living in Egypt for a few years because his, stepdad got a heads up about it? These parts of the story are almost as absurd as the actual miracles. But once you take them out, what's left? Well, maybe we have a few things, like, for example, his family. So were his parents named Mary and Joseph? Did he have a cousin named John the Baptist who was born to an elderly priest and a cousin of his mother? Maybe? But not only are their portrayals suspect, but the characters themselves seem to be built around formulaic and thematic parts of Jesus' origin story. I mean, it's technically possible that a skeletal structure of Mary's, Joseph's, Zechariah's, Elizabeth's, and John's depictions came from real people but got embellished. But so much of this structure seems designed to facilitate the embellishments that it seems to have been constructed for that purpose. For example, while some people like to laugh at the idea that the real Mary conceived Jesus through natural means without Joseph's help, the whole story seems contrived for the sake of placing Jesus in a nuclear family following a virgin birth, and Joseph's unexplained disappearance from the story makes him seem like a plot device meant to serve this purpose. Now, can I prove this means nothing about their stories are accurate? No, but I think you should see how someone might have reasonable suspicions. The most plausible parts of Jesus' childhood, such as being presented in the temple, are so generic they aren't uniquely Jesus, and any unique things that do happen at these events end up being something absurd like a priest breaking out into song about how amazing the baby will be. So did any real person ever have anything close to the childhood depicted in the Gospels? Draw your own conclusions, but seems unlikely to me. Almost everything we have about his early life is a series of legendary-sounding details strung together for literary purposes, and huge swaths of his childhood are summed up with, and then he got older and stronger and smarter. So here's the core question. If there were a historical Jesus, was his childhood anything like the one depicted in the Gospels? If not, it seems like we already have a huge strike against him being Jesus in any meaningful way. So let's move on to
Part 2. Jesus' Rise to Prominence.
Do we think that any real-life 12-year-old son of a carpenter showed up out of the Galilean backwoods and amazed Jerusalem's educated elites with how insightful he was? I guess it's not technically impossible, but come on. Was he foretold and baptized by John the Baptist? Well, maybe wild apocalyptic preachers interacted and promoted each other, and maybe they'd occasionally baptize each other. But as soon as we get any more detailed than that, we quickly run into weird questions. Did one of these preachers talk up the historical Jesus to the suspicious extent that John the Baptist talks up the character of Jesus? Did the historical Jesus ask a fellow preacher to baptize him only to get the answer of, "No, you should baptize me because you're so awesome"? Take those away, and aside from shenanigans about God yelling from heaven while the Holy Spirit comes and lands on Jesus' head, there's nothing specific left in the story. But I'm here to be fair, so let's look at a more realistic one. Did a real guy get driven out of his hometown for proclaiming himself the fulfillment of prophecy in Isaiah? I could actually see this happening, and it's a little hard to see why the writers would have come up with this out of nowhere. So add this to your list of things that happened to a historical Jesus if you want, but it's pretty meager pickings so far. And even then, this whole phenomenon could have been fairly common. Like how many of these upstart traveling preachers might have tried their thing at home only to be told, "Get out of here, idiot, we know you too well to fall for your act," so they wander off and find success elsewhere. Jesus even alludes to this being common in Luke 4:24. So is this a unique depiction of one guy, or just a common trope in a society with a lot of crazy traveling preachers? Hard to tell. One hint that doesn't bode well for it is that this story is only found in Luke, and Matthew gives an entirely different reason for him leaving Nazareth. So this sounds less like a biographical detail, and more like one of two reasons storytellers came up with to push Jesus out of the safety of his hometown hero's journey style. Of course, according to the formula, Jesus would get famous after being run out of town. So let's look at how he did that. The Gospels say he kicked off his career by going around offering unidentified teachings and doing miracles, which doesn't do much for us because one's just a vague description of what any successful teacher would do, and the other is silly. But there is one more big way that Jesus is depicted gaining fame, and that's through just totally owning the religious elites every time he talks to them. So did this happen in real life? Did some backwater firebrand go toe-to-toe with the most educated legal and religious minds of Judea and always produce just the right argument to shut them up on the spot? And did they just shut up like good sports? Sounds far-fetched, but let's look at some of the arguments the Gospels show him using. When asked whether it was right to pay taxes to Caesar, Jesus just showed that Caesar's face was on a coin and said, "Give to Caesar what is Caesar's and to God what is God's," which is nonsense that doesn't even address the issue they were bringing up. Or when asked if people are resurrected after death, he reasons that they must be because God still identified himself as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob after they were dead, which is a total non sequitur that makes Jesus sound like an idiot. When confronted for blasphemy because he told a guy he forgave him, Jesus asked whether it's easier to say, "I forgive you," or pick up your mat and walk. But what does that mean? The religious leaders served Jesus up with just a super easy chance to say something substantial about the nature of forgiveness or blasphemy. But instead he just asks an apparently pointless hypothetical question about which of the two phrases is easier to say. It's ridiculous, and this is typical of almost all his arguments. The most coherent one he ever made was probably, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. But while this at least has a core truth about the point of the Sabbath, it overlooks a vital core point, which was that this was an enforceable law with a death penalty. Now, would it be that weird if a historical Jesus ran around making dumb arguments? No. People do that all the time, and we know it because we're on the internet. But what's crazy is the reaction to these arguments. Every single time Jesus pops off a silly one-liner, the crowd is amazed, Jesus punctuates the argument with a miracle, or the religious leaders are stunned into silence and often wander off all embarrassed, sometimes plotting his death because they're jealous of how awesome he was. It's all literally the ancient version of, and then everybody clapped. Now, maybe a real guy made these arguments and got a different reaction, and maybe his fans rewrote the story to show him winning every time? It's possible. But with the specific quips so central to each story and the authors at best inheriting them from oral tradition, it seems unlikely that they substantially reflect actual arguments some guy made decades earlier. This is something you'll find we're running into a lot. Any detail that's even slightly believable is so minor yet so focal to the totally unbelievable story it's embedded in that it's hard to see how we can be confident that 1. The gospel writers inherited and recorded such a small detail with any accuracy while getting everything else so terribly wrong, and 2. An outrageous story that's so well served by that detail would just organically crystallize around it without altering it. I mean, there is some nuance in this, so draw your own conclusions, but it seems weird. At the very least, we could entertain an alternative, which is that these stories came from people fantasizing about populist grassroots firebrands sticking it to the out-of-touch religious establishment. Seems like something that could happen, right? Now, maybe Christians had overheard some wild-eyed Greg Locke type ranting at the religious elites. Maybe they occasionally thought, ooh, that's a good one, and that fed into the narrative. Just as likely, maybe Christians brought in different stories from a variety of wild-eyed ranters. Who knows? It's hard to tell, which is why I think all this stuff about Jesus being historical is more murky than people make it out to be. That said, let's move on to
Part 3. Jesus' Disciples.
If there were an actual Jesus that anybody remembers, he must have gathered followers, right? So it's worth asking whether the Gospels portray this in a way that points to one unique person. Did a real person find his first followers by hanging out at docks recruiting fishermen? Possibly. But did he convince them to join him by giving miraculous fishing instructions as in Luke? I'd guess not. Or did he just say, follow me, and they went, okay, fine, and gave up their livelihoods on the spot as in Matthew and Mark? Better, but still sounds weird. Or did they spontaneously leave another preacher to follow Jesus after that preacher called him the Lamb of God as in John? Again, possible but sounds weird, especially because it involves one preacher weirdly fawning over another one the way John the Baptist does with Jesus. Did one guy follow him because he magically knew the guy had been sitting under a tree? Decide for yourself, I guess. But even looking at the broader strokes, were there 12 disciples? I guess maybe it's possible. Maybe Jesus happened to gather a thematically significant number of followers and the factually challenged gospel writers happened to record it precisely? Or, and here's an idea, or maybe the number 12 came down to the gospel writers through oral tradition and ended up being recorded because it was thematically significant? They're both possible, I guess, but the second one seems more likely, especially considering the pains Acts took to steer the number back to 12 after the deaths of Judas. Now we could strip these elements away and have a real guy who gathered some disciples, maybe 12, maybe not, but probably not in the way Jesus did in the Gospels. But once we do that, we're not describing anybody specific at all, just making a vague reference that could be to pretty much any Judean preacher gathering followers. And that's before considering that these accounts conflict so obviously that Christians sometimes organize them into a pre-call, an official call, and a confirmation of the call, which, is extremely silly. So even if one is true, which one is? And if two of them got them wrong, how do we know the third didn't? Even worse, John adds the one about Jesus helping Peter fish to a later part of the story, which, sounds an awful lot like these are just vague oral traditions that the gospel writers plugged in wherever they thought they fit best. Anyway, let's move on to a really big core part of the story, which is
Part 4. Jesus' Ministry.
I'm actually not going to go into too much detail on this, because even though it makes up the bulk of the Gospels, it doesn't contain a lot of biographical detail you can pin on a specific person. Sure, there are a lot of mentions of Jesus traveling to a specific place or having a specific conversation, But these are so thinly scattered across the middle of the narrative that it would take forever to pick through them. So instead of spending hours trudging through, did he climb onto a mountain to give a sermon? Did he speak to a woman at a well? Did he get so exhausted that he retreated from the crowds and on and on and on? I'll leave you to look over them and come to your own conclusions. If the way I've modeled the process so far helps you, then great. Really, most of those details just provide narrative structure for two things at the core of his ministry: his teachings and his miracles. The miracles are silly, of course, so then it becomes a question of what the teachings tell us. Do they indicate the existence of a single person who could be considered Jesus? Well, in theory, they could move us pretty far along this chart by telling us what a historical Jesus thought and valued, as well as how he inspired the Christian movement. But do we know they all came from one person? Some predate Jesus, the Golden Rule being just one obvious example, and a lot of others are so mundane and trite that they don't exactly sound like world-changing insights from an inspirational teacher. I mean, maybe the Gospels accurately record one specific person reiterating or plagiarizing a variety of teachings, maybe sometimes articulating his own banalities. But this sounds pretty run-of-the-mill for preachers at that time, doesn't it? To confidently say that these came from one person and one person alone, and thus that they made him uniquely Jesus, we'd have to conclude that, first, one historical person taught everything collected in the Gospels by himself. Second, the earliest Christians latched onto his teachings and his teachings alone, not those of other similar preachers, then passed them along by word of mouth without corrupting them with their own interjections, things new converts heard from other preachers or common sayings or stories, and did this all accurately enough to preserve a unified body of teachings that meaningfully represent the ideas of one historical person. Third, that the Gospel writers, each of whom we know slanted their accounts with specific agendas, articulated these teachings in a way that captured the spirit of what a decades dead and gone person had to say instead of what they meant to say. And that this astonishing level of accuracy was maintained in this one specific area by people who screwed up everything else in the Gospels to the point of filling them with miracles. Draw your own conclusions, and I say that sincerely because this is a tricky topic, but there does seem to be room for doubt here. Finally, let's look at
Part 5. The Death of Jesus.
This is the detail it seems we have most reason to believe happened to a historical Jesus. And I don't just mean that in the snarky sense of course he would have died because everybody dies. I mean that at least intuitively it seems hard to explain Christianity without the death of a real-life teacher. If I had to hazard a guess, I'd say the early proto-Christians were an apocalyptic cult trying to cope with the death of a real-life teacher, and that Christianity evolved from their attempts to reimagine promises of revolutionary change that were dashed after he was killed. However, this isn't something we know. It's a logical inference, even if one I personally find believable. So it's worth asking questions to help avoid jumping too decisively to overly specific conclusions. Even if we do suspect that a real teacher was executed, was it in a way that made him uniquely Jesus? I see two ways of looking at this question. First, how uncommon was it for these preachers to run into trouble and get put to death? In the volatile environment of first-century Judea, with tensions brewing between the Jews in Rome as well as between the people and religious elites, it seems like unpredictable firebrands escalating things by preaching messages about, apocalyptic disruption of the status quo would have a dangerous tendency to run afoul of the wrong people. So does being one of these targets make someone Jesus? Maybe if his death inspired the movement. But do we know the death of one teacher inspired the movement? That would be my first guess, but I don't see it as inevitable. Maybe Christianity was built on vaguely remembered stories of multiple martyred preachers. Or maybe just a general sense of deflation after a bunch of movements didn't pan out too much. It's hard to say. Even then, how meaningful is it to call someone Jesus just because his execution inspired the religion? I'm not saying it doesn't at all, it's just a question to consider. Second, how much of his execution was like that described in the Gospels? Did a real guy predict his own betrayal? Maybe based on a gut-level feeling. But the Gospel story is just weird and formulaic. Besides, it seems like a real guy might have acted on his suspicions. I don't know, maybe suggest to the other disciples that things should happen to snitches? Did a Roman governor let the locals bully him into crucifying someone for blasphemy? And did he release a dangerous criminal, whose name is literally Son of the Father, no symbolism there, at their prompting? Were dramatic flourishes like a crown of thorns and a sign calling him King of the Jews part of the thing? Did a criminal next to him immediately repent and ask to be remembered in the afterlife? That would be weird. Did the Romans gratuitously stab him in the side in a way that conveniently adds to Promethean imagery? It's hard to tell. So even when we seem to have some clarity that something happened to Jesus, the whole thing is made murky by details ranging from questionable to ridiculous. In fact, the deduction that he was a martyr doesn't even have to mean he was crucified. Like, what if the Sanhedrin just arranged for him to be knifed in a back alley or something? That at least gets us around questions about Rome getting involved in executing people over their local theological differences, right? But, apologists might say, Christians wouldn't make up a story about Jesus being crucified because it was the most humiliating way to die in ancient Rome. But this is where we see how tricky criterion of embarrassment arguments can be. When you assume that ancient people would have been constrained by a single motivation that feels intuitive to a modern audience, you're bound to jump to conclusions at the expense of reasonable alternatives. Maybe a public execution in front of Jesus' followers was more dramatic and emotionally evocative than just being unceremoniously discarded. Maybe the drawn-out public death allowed for interactions and conversations that were compelling and/or had worked their way into oral tradition. Maybe the humiliation was a feature of the story, not a bug. After all, when you're fixated on persecution, horrifying deaths are validating, not embarrassing. Once you think about it, there are all kinds of reasons a crucifixion story could have arisen around the smallest germ of rumor about the loss of a cult leader, especially considering how much the crucifixion is tied to obviously legendary parts of the story. Now, some people might question how much pure legend could have arisen so quickly. I mean, with as few as 40 years between the purported life of Jesus and the first gospel, how could they get that much wrong? Well, pretty easily, apparently. And we have a couple indications of this. First is how quickly the story got so badly out of control. If early proto-Christians couldn't even make it a few decades without filling their accounts with healings, water walking, resurrections, and flying to heaven like Superman, maybe we shouldn't automatically trust how they preserve the natural parts just because they're not magic? Second, the Bible itself indicates the story was largely up for question well before the Gospels. At the halfway point between Jesus and the first Gospels, we have the Apostle Paul showing almost no awareness of the details of Jesus' life, which is a little weird. You can say he wasn't an eyewitness himself or wasn't primarily concerned with Jesus' earthly ministry, but if we're to assume a substantial historical Jesus, Paul would have had to have been pretty much going out of his way to avoid talking about him, which is bizarre. If we were a mere 20 years after Christ on a timeline in which accurate stories would hold together until the Gospels were written, it seems Christianity would be saturated with fresh, accurate accounts reinforced by people who had actually been there. Yet at this point the information's already so thin, the story's so unreliable, that Paul's already complaining about Christians confusing each other with false gospels, appealing to his supernatural revelation to explain things about Jesus, and getting away with claiming that people at that time had seen Jesus rise from the dead. So how much accurate information do we think started with a historical Jesus, made it through this wild west of rumor, and got into the ears of gospel writers? It seems we at least have reason to suspect that, if members of this community had interacted with anybody who was meaningfully Jesus, information about him would have degenerated into basically nothing within the first decade or two, and whatever came after that was built back up out of theology and unfettered rumor. So as we look through gospel stories and ask ourselves questions about which are at all believable or which we can confidently say made it through the swamp of oral tradition with any accuracy, one thing becomes clear. We're dealing less with a concrete yes-no question, did a historical Jesus exist, and more with a ship of Theseus-type philosophical question, did enough of a real-life man make it into depictions of Jesus that they could be considered the same person? And considering some of the legends that replaced that man's life could have been vague memories of other teachers rather than just pure fiction, are we even talking about one embellished life, or a tale based on the idea of common traveling preachers? I can't say exactly, but I can say that the issue is murky. It's not a question about one story. It's a question about multiple stories, and each of those stories presents us a gray area in terms of what truths we can take from them and how certain we can be about them. So as we try to nudge our concept of Jesus away from a lot of traveling preachers roamed Judea and see how far we can get toward he was exactly the person shown in the Gospels, I think we should recognize that what we're doing is extremely imprecise, that the boundaries between historicity and mythicism can be weird and fuzzy, and maybe people who disagree on something so imprecise and fuzzy might do so for good reasons, and perhaps don't actually disagree as much as we think. When it's all said and done, maybe we should take it easy on each other, and stop doing Christians the favor of ripping ourselves to shreds over how real we think their favorite character was. This program was made possible by a grant from John Adams, Bob Generic, Maggie Danger, S.R. Foxley, Daniel Bostedt, Magnus Holmgren, and Q, and by the generous support of viewers like you. If you'd like to join them in pledging to this channel, please find a link to the Prophet of Zod Patreon below.